Hello everyone, my name is Aakanksh Gurnani, and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism spectrum disorder, and more. On the channel, I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists, seeking their views and updates on their latest work, research, etc. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. Sarah Jane Nuttall is a dedicated PhD student at Leeds Beckett University, where she focuses her research on autism in women and girls. Diagnosed with autism later in life, Sarah brings a unique and personal perspective to her work, aiming to shed light on the often overlooked experiences of autistic women and girls. Her research seeks to challenge misconceptions and promote a deeper understanding of autism, advocating for greater awareness and support with both academic and broader communities. Ms. Nuttall, welcome and thank you very much for the time today.
Hi, Aakanksh. Call me Sarah, please.
The terms neurodivergent and neurodivergence are often misattributed and wrongly used interchangeably with neurodiverse and neurodiversity. Can you please help define these terms and explain their meaning?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people get mixed up on, and it is difficult to wrap your head around it. But basically, neurodiversity simply means a complete range of different cognitive styles, brain functions, traits. So obviously, the diversity encompasses everybody, really. So in reality, everybody's brain functions slightly differently. Okay. So it really, all human beings as a group are neurodiverse. Okay. So there's no such thing as a normal brain. So the neurodiversity umbrella includes everyone. And I think that's sometimes a difficult one for people to wrap their heads around, because they think that neurotypicals or the predominant neurotype don't fit under there, but they do. Everybody fits under that. So for example, if a company employed both neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals, then they could call themselves a neurodiverse company. Okay. Now, just to point out here, even though neurological diversity and neurodiversity first appeared in print in Harvey Bloom, he states that it was actually the autistic community that came up with these ideas originally. It's mostly attributed and wrongly attributed just to one person, which is the autistic sociology, Judy Singer. But in actual fact, it came from the autistic community. So that's neurodiversity. That covers everybody, if you will. Whereas an individual can be neurodivergent. So that means that they diverge from what is considered to be neurotypical, or the predominant neurotype, if you like. So for example, I am neurodivergent. I'm autistic with ADHD. So I'm a neurodivergent person. So neurodivergence covers all those ways of being that diverge from what is sort of neurotypical. Okay, so, and the words neurodivergent and neurodivergence were only coined in the year 2000 by Kassian Asasumasu, who is a multiply neurodivergent neurodiversity activist. So I've got both those words in there. It's quite difficult. So only groups can be neurodiverse, individuals are neurodivergent. I hope that helps a bit.
And I also wanted to ask you about your journey and specifically of being diagnosed with autism later in life.
Yeah, I mean that has been such a momentous thing for me, because I didn't get a diagnosis until 4 years ago when I was 54. So I really come from what we call the lost generation. autism wasn't really a thing, when I was at school. And it wasn't until a friend of mine, her son was being diagnosed with autism. So I thought, this is really fascinating. I want to kind of look more into this. And I did a free online open university course about autism. And whilst I was reading this stuff, I was thinking, oh, this is me. Some of this stuff is me, and I always felt quite an affinity with her son. We seemed to get on. I seemed to get him quite well. And so I started just kind of looking into this a little bit more. But all my brain was like jumping in with the imposter syndrome, saying, "Oh no, you can't possibly be autistic," because it's little boys who are into trains that are autistic. You've had a career and you've been married and all this kind of stuff. So it took me quite a while to reach a point where I thought, well, yeah, maybe I am autistic. And I read a book called Spectrum Women, edited by Barbara Cook. And that was quite a turning point for me, because I suddenly realized that women and girls and other marginalized genders can present completely differently from this stereotyped image of what it is to be autistic. And I guess for me, that was my light bulb moment when I suddenly thought, oh, wow, this actually is me. So I asked my doctor for an assessment, and I received my diagnosis over the phone at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I had this telephone call just saying, oh, yes, you're autistic. That's why you've had difficulties with certain issues. Thank you. Goodbye. So I was left with this really life-changing diagnosis and no support whatsoever. So me being me, I started reading and I just carried on reading, which is how I ended up doing a PhD. But I suppose if I look back on my life, because I'm also writing a novel, which is helping me to reframe my life in a way. So if I look back on my life now, I can think, well, yeah, it was kind of obvious. I always felt a bit of an outsider, and I was like the nerd or the geek at school. I was the brainy kid that really loved learning. And I ended up at at high school being head girl. I don't know, do you call it like president of school
Yeah.
or captain or something like that? Do you know what I mean? Over the whole school, which I'm still shocked about now. But I think that was just because, of my learning and the academic side of things. And when I think back as well, I've always been a researcher, and I would spend hours reading in my bedroom. Sometimes it was fiction, sometimes it was non-fiction. And I'd have obsessions for a while, like, I'd be really into horses or ballet or whatever it was, and I'd read about these things for hours and hours on end. At one point, I really wanted to be a spy, because obviously who wouldn't want to be a spy? And when I look back on it now, I'm like, well, do you know, that kind of fits, because I think as autistic people, we're really good at observing. We're good at observing other people, and we're good at mirroring, and we're great at investigative work, which is what research is as well. So when I look back on it now and I kind of reframe my life, then yes, it starts to make a bit more sense to me, do you know? But my diagnosis has been one of the most important things really that's happened to me.
And what challenges and revelations do you think you encountered after receiving your diagnosis?
It's been quite a journey, and it's taken a lot of processing for me to get to where I am now. And I think I'm still learning about myself, which is great. But I think one of the first things that happened when I got my diagnosis was that people didn't believe me. And from what I understand, this happens quite regularly, particularly with women and girls. And my family was saying, oh, no, you can't possibly be autistic because, and they were even saying things like, oh, you did gymnastics and drama at school, so how can you be autistic? and there were very stereotyped sort of ideas around autism. I have to say, sort of several years down the line, even my mum is kind of getting on board, and she's 85, and she's starting to understand a little bit more about me. But I think I went through some steps that I understand through research a lot of autistic women, particularly late diagnosed ones, go through. And it almost seems to follow, a kind of specific number of steps. So first of all, there's a disbelief from people around you, but you also struggle to believe it yourself because you've lived your whole life up until this point, as far as you were aware, as a non-autistic person. So you thought, and then suddenly you're like, no, your whole identity is not that. It's something else. So it takes a while. And like, as I said before, the imposter syndrome kicks in. And you think, especially as a woman, oh no, that can't possibly be me, because we're so kind of engineered to think about autism in certain ways as a result of the media, for example, and the sort of stereotypes that we have to deal with. And I think once I did start to think, yes, this is me, I am autistic, I think the overwhelming feeling then was one of grief, because I felt so sad that I'd managed to get to 54 and not know what my real self was, what my sort of authentic self was. And obviously, because it was never recognized, life was difficult and it was stressful. And there's part of me that thinks, if I'd known I'd had a diagnosis, then my life might have been easier. Autistic women and girls are very vulnerable to abuse in relationships and sexual abuse, amongst other things. But I think if you're armed with knowledge about yourself, you can maybe protect yourself and be a bit safer, if you will. So that grief is still there. It kind of still lingers, although, I'm really happy to be where I am and to know that I'm autistic now. And then as a result of that, I have kind of allowed myself to be more authentic. So whereas in the past, I masked so heavily that it was utterly exhausting, particularly around things like sensory issues, which often occur frequently in women and girls. So, like I've got blue eyeglasses that I wear, and I'll wear, earplugs, and I will make allowances for myself. Whereas before, when I used to socialize, when I was younger, I used to use alcohol to kind of deaden things, to reduce the sensory input, or to try to fit in socially. And I don't do that now. I choose whether I want to go to something or not. And I might then decide, okay, I'm only going to stay an hour, or I might reach a point where I'm like, no, that's it. I'm overwhelmed. I've had enough. And I'm more confident to say, right, I'm leaving now. So I think it's allowed me to sort of not just reframe my past, but reframe my present and to be a lot kinder to myself.
And do you have any insights or advice you'd like to share with our viewers about kind of the process and the experience of self and late diagnosis?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, obviously, I can only speak from a UK perspective mostly, because that was my experience. But I do know through research that getting a diagnosis as a girl, a woman, anybody who is from any marginalized gender can be really, really difficult. And it's also much more difficult if you come from global majority as well. And if you're at an intersection of those, it can make it doubly and triply difficult to be able to get a diagnosis. I think there are still an awful lot of stereotypes and misconceptions around autism, and clinicians bring their own biases as well to, diagnosing or gatekeeping or whatever. I think it's also very difficult because societally women and girls are expected to be a certain way. We tend to mask more and camouflage, to try and pass as though we're not autistic. But because we've been doing that for so much in our life, it's very hard to unmask. And you might go in to see a doctor in the hope of being referred for an assessment, and it's difficult to stop masking. So the doctor will just see, instead of listening to our words, the doctor may just look at what they have in front of them and go, no, you can't possibly be autistic. You can give me eye contact, for example, So I think that makes it difficult. In the UK, we tend to use screening tools such as the AQ10 or AQ50. I don't know if you've come across those. But they are very much geared up for a male presentation. And so that's right at the start. That's screening you to see whether you'll be put forward for an assessment or not. So I think a lot of women, girls, and other genders are screened out right from the start because the tools don't work for us. And then when you get onto the assessments themselves, I think those assessment tools also are very much geared up for a typical presentation of a white cisgendered heterosexual male, if you like. And I would like to point out that the diagnostic criteria, if you look at the DSM-5, okay, the diagnostic criteria actually are wide enough and general enough to encompass different presentations. And especially now, since the last update in 2013, and they've now included sensory issues, which brings a lot more women and girls into the mix, if you will. But it's still really difficult, to get through the gatekeeper who then refers you on to a clinician who may be, biased in all sorts of ways. And then the screening tools and the assessment tools that aren't brilliantly geared up for us. It's difficult, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. What are some of the most common misconceptions about autism in women and girls that you aim to address with your research?
Yeah, I think the presentations can be so different. I'd just like to say, generally speaking, autism is heterogeneous, which means that we all present differently anyway. You can't sort of put us all in the same category because we're all so different. So that's the first thing that people need to be aware of, that we all are different. All autistic people are different anyway. But I think there are certain things that you can say about women and girls and how we present differently that perhaps clinicians could pick up on. So, for example, our special interests or passions may well be those of girls and teenagers generally in the general population. So we might be into things like horses, or we might be into makeup and fashion, which is what you'd expect. We might read lots of fiction, of literature, novels, that kind of thing, which again you might expect in girls. But I think the difference is the intensity to which we do these things. So, if you've got a girl that's presenting who, like me, used to love reading, but was like so obsessed with reading and read so many books every week, it's that intensity perhaps that clinicians need to pick up on. I think generally across the board research suggests that women and girls have more sensory issues. So for example, and this is according to my partner, who is male and who doesn't have the same sensory issues as I do, my hearing is really acute. And I'm like to people, can't you hear that? Why can't, I mean, that's really, can't you hear that? And other people can't. When I say things like I can hear electricity in walls, or I can hear the Wi-Fi, or I don't know if you have it over there, but we have these things that are cat deterrents to keep cats off people's lawns. And they emit this really high-pitched noise that apparently only cats are supposed to hear. And I can hear those, so that's one thing. And my sense of smell is extremely heightened as well. So I think that's one of the things, that women and girls present with differently that might form part of their profile or whatever. I think there are also cultural aspects to things as well. I think that women often are expected to act a certain way. There are cultural things around eye contact, for example. But because we try to fit in, and we try to kind of live up to this idea of how we should be in our particular culture, whatever that is, then I think sometimes the autism can be masked. I mean, that eye contact thing, just being able to give eye contact, a lot of clinicians say, you can't be autistic because you give me eye contact. I can do it. I might find it intense and difficult to do sometimes, but I've trained myself to do it. And to think, and a lot of women say this, that they look at somebody and they count for so many seconds, and then they look away, and then they look back again, because it's not something that comes naturally to us, but we can sometimes do it. And because women are very good at mirroring, at copying people's body language and things, that's another thing that can mask autism. I think women and girls, when we do find things difficult, when we struggle with things, we tend to internalize things. I think societally, it's more acceptable for men and boys to kind of act out, or to become more angry. So, I'm not saying this is across the board, but I think it's more acceptable, for a man or a boy to kind of express their emotions in an external way, whereas women and girls tend to internalize things. And as a result of that, we quite often suffer with things like anxiety and depression. We're more prone to self-harm and to have suicidal ideation, sadly. And eating disorders as well quite often can manifest as a result of some of the difficulties that we experience. So I think that's part of a slightly different profile. And I'm kind of highly aware, because of my own conditions. I've also got Ehlers-Danlos, which is a connective tissue disorder, and a form of hypermobility. And I've got POTS, which is postural tachycardia syndrome, which can make me dizzy and affect my blood pressure and things like that. And there's lots of research proving this, women and girls, more than autistic males, are more likely to have these co-occurring health conditions, like the physical ones, like the connective tissue disorders, gastrointestinal issues, hormonal issues as well, thyroid issues, diabetes. I mean, sadly, the list goes on, and we are more likely to be living with chronic pain, according to the research. And I think that is something, and what clinicians need to do is to start trying to join up the dots and to make the connections. So when somebody presents, they need to start, there are so many different kind of factors and elements that they need to look at, and then think, okay, I need to somehow join the dots on this. Maybe this person is neurodivergent, and they have these co-occurring conditions.
So, in regards to neurodivergence and fatigue, can you explain that to our audience?
Yeah, I'll try to. Yeah, this is something that I've been discussing recently, on LinkedIn. And I think that if you are neurodivergent and you are living in a world that is set up for the predominant neurotype, or neurotypical people, that in itself is absolutely exhausting because you're constantly trying to fit in, you're trying to mask, you're trying to read and understand other people's body language and communications. Neurotypical people they don't always say things very directly and literally. And sometimes as autistic people, we find it difficult to infer from what other people are saying. And I will quite often have to say, can you just be specific? Or can you tell me exactly what do you mean by that? And that trying to figure out what's going on can be really, really exhausting. And then I think, if you've got sensory overwhelm, you're in the workplace and there are bright lights and you're working in an open plan office and there's lots of noise going on and there's nowhere to go and retreat to and have some quiet time to recuperate, then you're going to get tired. And then if you factor in what I've just been talking about, which is co-occurring health conditions, which often bring fatigue, like Ehlers-Danlos, then it's not really surprising that neurodivergent people generally are overwhelmed with fatigue.
And is that different from autistic burnout? And how do you prevent autistic burnout?
Okay, I think what happens is, and this is based on my own experience as well, is that everyday fatigue builds up and can lead to autistic burnout. Now, I'd just like to say that autistic burnout is different from regular burnout. I think lots of people who work hard, long hours can burn out just from the exhaustion of working too hard, do you know? But if you, on top of that, on top of doing that with your job, if you add into the mix those other things that I talked about, masking and having different expectations. Autistic people often struggle with life changes and transitions. There's all sorts of things, like we also struggle with boundaries. So there are so many things that are kind of coming one on top of another. So autistic burnout is all those things, or a lot of those things, coming together to create this extreme exhaustion. It's not just exhaustion. When I had a massive burnout, I could barely function. I couldn't move from the couch. I was practically non-speaking. I was struggling to actually speak when I was massively burnt out. So it is different for, and it's usually long term. It's something that just is pervasive. It's like your whole life is affected by it, and it will last for quite a while, and it can take a long time to kind of recover from that. Yeah. Okay.
And how do we prevent autistic burnout?
Okay. I think, again, it's quite difficult because autistic people, for example, I struggle with something called alexithymia, where I can't always figure out what my own feelings are, or it can take me a long time to identify what my feelings are and then to process those. So, my exhaustion can be building, and interoception as well, which is things to do with like hunger and thirst and feeling tired. So I might be feeling stressed and tired, but sometimes it can take me a while to figure that out. By the time I'm figuring it out, I'm already going under, if you see what I mean with the burnout. So I think it's difficult to pick up on those signals till it's too late sometimes. But I do think there are things that we can put in place before we reach burnout, or once we've recovered from burnout, to hopefully not enter that state again, if you will. And I think some of the things that we can put in place is thinking about support and help from others. And that could be physical support. It can also be support from online autistic communities, which are absolutely fantastic. Some of us pets can be really, really helpful because, cats, dogs, whatever can help you to sort of self-regulate, and they've got really nice kind of sensory things about them. I think allowing ourselves to stim when we feel like we want to stim, and to seek, safe places or quiet places is really helpful. Asking for reasonable adjustments in the workplace, figuring out what you do need and what does upset you in the workplace, and then asking, can I sit and work in a booth by myself somewhere quieter? Can I wear earphones? Can I work somewhere where it's slightly dimmer or whatever? And I think because we're not always good at picking up on ourselves and what's going on, I think doing things like actually scheduling in breaks, like even on your phone. Okay, I'm going to have a break every 2 hours, because it's so easy for us to get into something so intensely that we forget even to use the bathroom or whatever it is, So I think things like that can be very helpful reminders in helping you.
You have strong views about ABA. Could you share your personal experience with it and how those experiences have shaped your perspective?
Yeah, I'd like to start off just by saying that because I'm not necessarily keen on some forms of ABA, doesn't mean to say that I don't think that interventions can't be a good thing for autistic people. And I think that there are therapists of all kinds that work closely with autistic people that are really helpful, like speech and language therapists, for example, or people work, physiotherapists working with motor skills and things. But I think what's important is that they work with the autistic people, and sort of ask them about their preferences, because neuroplasticity is an amazing thing. The brain can reroute, it can grow new neural networks and things. And, autistic people and neurodivergent people can do that, which is fantastic. Listening to the autistic community, lots of people have had bad experiences with ABA. And I'm not saying this is always the case, but particularly from my generation, if I didn't conform to how my mother wanted me to be, for example, then, we would get hit, we'd get a slap. And you reach a point where you don't want to be hit, so you do as you're told. And I think there are different approaches to ABA for sure, but that kind of approach can be very, very damaging. I also think as well that maybe society needs to have a think about how it approaches autistic people, because obviously we're expected to fit in with these neuronormative ways of being. Really, what ABA often is trying to do is to get autistic people to pass as neurotypical people. And I think fundamentally there's something wrong with that, because why can't we just be accepted as we are? I mean, there are lots of ways of communicating, but in our societies, quite often, we put a huge premium on the spoken word. And it's, for a lot of autistic people, that's not the most natural way of communicating. I'm very privileged and I can do it, but I much prefer writing. I much prefer writing. So I think where ABA is concerned, there can be very positive approaches, but at the same time, can we not just accept that it's okay to be autistic and to have different ways of being? And for me, this kind of brings in Damien Milton's idea about the double empathy problem, where as autistic people, we are expected to try to fit in with the norms of society, but that doesn't work the other way around. So it's very, very rare that you'll find a non-autistic person who's prepared to communicate with an autistic person in the autistic person's preferred way of communicating. So, for example, neurotypicals love small talk. They like talking about, I don't know, the weather and holidays and their children and that kind of thing. Autistic people like going into really big, deep philosophical conversations or info dumping about their latest interest, which isn't acceptable to neurotypicals. And I think there's got to be, it's a two-way street. There's got to be a two-way thing. So much as I recognize that interventions, if they're done properly and they take on board what the autistic person also, their preferences, perhaps, their ways of being and their interests, then that's fantastic. It can work really well. I know that there are people like Temple Grandin and Tito Mukhopadhyay who themselves have said, we were non-speaking as children, but we could understand everything. But they have a lot of respect and time for the people that worked with them to kind of help them to get over some of the disconnects between their brain and their body. So I think just personally, because of the generation I came from, I think, that idea of the stick rather than the carrot is not a good idea. So work with autistic people and with their preferences and their needs.
What changes would you like to see in the field of autism research and support?
This is one that a lot of us who are actually autistic researchers are kind of pioneering and looking for, which is that more autistic researchers are on board. If you look at Nick Chown and some of the critical autism studies stuff, there is this recommendation that actually, if you're doing research, you should have autistic researchers. You should have autistic participants from across the range of presentations, from different cultures and backgrounds and different genders, etc., etc. Because unfortunately, at the moment, autistic researchers are not as valued as non-autistic researchers. And there is this erroneous idea that non-autistic researchers know better, that they're more qualified to make decisions and choices for autistic people. And in actual fact, our lived experience is vitally important, and the whole nothing about us without us kind of disability drive applies in the same thing, in the same way to us. And I think what we need to do is we need more research in lots of different areas. As I've said, particularly women, girls, other marginalized genders, global majority people. We need more research into how they present with autism. We need more research into co-occurring health issues. We need to look at representations of autistic people in the media, and it's quite heartening because more autistic people are beginning to, write for TV, for example, and even star in TV shows, rather than it being a representation of an autistic person through the eyes of a non-autistic person. We are being given more agency. And I think that's one of the most important things, is that we need to give a space and a forum to as many autistic voices as possible, so that it's autistic people ourselves that are being listened to. And I know that, we are getting more and more celebrities who are coming out and saying, yeah, I'm neurodivergent, which is fantastic. We're getting more people writing memoirs and autobiographies. And that's all really, really helpful. But I still think we've got, quite some way to go yet.
And so in regards to that, we've got quite some way to go. What are your future goals, both academically and personally, in the field of autism?
This is a difficult one. I about 12 years ago, when I had my massive autistic burnout, I stopped teaching because that's what I was doing at the time. And so I'm kind of in a different realm now, because I retired from teaching. I don't ever want to go back into full-time employment. So I guess what I'm trying to do is things that are more on my own terms to try to avoid autistic burnout again. So I'm learning to put boundaries in place and say no to certain things, and to be kind of picky about what I do get involved in. One of the things I am doing, which I'm very excited about, is I am writing a novel as part of my PhD with an autistic protagonist in it. And the novel is set in some archives, but it's also an archive really of my life to some extent. And I am hoping that it might help people to recognize different presentations of autism, to read it and think, oh yeah, that's like me. Because my experience of the world is very much embodied. It's very much through my senses. And even though I can't always figure out what my own emotions are, I pick up an awful lot of information via my senses, and I can sit next to other people and I can feel their emotions. It's really bizarre. I think they call it being a hyper empath. So I can't necessarily pick up on my own emotions, but I can really strongly pick up on other people's emotions. So I'm hoping that the novel it's one kind of presentation, if you like, of autism, but I'm really hoping that it will help people to think about themselves, to help support other autistic people as well, and the kind of processes that they go through. So that's one of my ambitions, is to get that novel published. That would be fantastic for me. I will continue to do presentations and lectures, which is what I'm doing now. And much like yourself, it's all about the advocacy work. I want to bring people together and communities together, and to kind of put out information about how women, girls, and other marginalized genders present so differently. So I want to educate people, really, I guess. I've got a website called autisticgals.com, which I started up because there was so little information out there. And I wanted to start bringing together useful resources. But it's also a place where I can blog. And I know a huge number of women have come to me and said, and, sort of teenagers, and have said, just reading the stuff on your blog has really helped me, because it's allowed me to go, wow, yeah, that's me. I'm very similar to this. And it's allowed me to kind of accept that side of myself and think, yeah, do you know what? It's okay, because there's this other woman out there who's experiencing similar things to me, you know. I think I mentioned before, I post quite a lot on LinkedIn. That seems to be a really good forum, because it gives me a balance of kind of talking about academic articles and papers and making them more accessible for people as well, which is one of the things that I hope to do. I am going to be speaking next week, in fact, at the Leeds Disability Studies Conference, about a paper that I have kind of put together. And that's something that I'd like to do, is a little bit more speaking at conferences. But I think, and I'm guessing that you're like this as well, that it is about the advocacy work, because autistic people aren't always great at advocating for themselves, but we can be brilliant at advocating for other people. We hate injustice, and if we can help somebody, we will do. So for me, every time that I help to raise awareness, or help to educate somebody, or to advocate for somebody, I think that also gives me healing. Because when I talk about my grief and my loss at not knowing I was autistic and not receiving the support that I needed, if I can help other people to get that, that's healing me as well. So yeah, it's about the advocacy work, I think.
Miss Sarah, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I look forward to reading your book and good luck at your conference.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for inviting me on here, and for giving me the chance to kind of spread more information about this topic, which obviously is very, very close to my heart. So thank you very much for that.